Rex,
But
now, we have got a fabulous guest.
Absolutely. I'd like to introduce her, Melanie Phillips. For those of you not familiar with Melanie Phillips, she's one of the great columnists at The Times in London. She's been an absolute giant of British journalism for many, many years. Melanie, welcome to our show. Ross Cameron, Rowan Dean. Melanie, welcome. Before we get into... You live in Jerusalem and you moved there. Before we get into talking about Israel and Palestine, etc., which I'd love to pick your brains on, first of all, what is fascinating about you to both Ross and I is the move you made from being quite a kind of hard left journo in your youth, I think it was The Guardian or elsewhere, and you made a transition to what can, be called more conservative. Is that a fair summation? And tell us about that transition.
I don't attach any labels to myself. Other people attach plenty of labels to me. What happened was that I did have a significant change in view. I remain committed, as I always was throughout my life, to the same principles. The betterment of society, concern to protect the vulnerable, a desire to stand up against abuses of power wherever they should be. And what changed was that the people that I believed that were on my side, the left, turned out to be on the other side. And over the years, issue by issue in my journalism, as I went through them, I discovered that the left was impervious, it seemed to me, to facts, to evidence, to reason, and above all, to truth. And because they denied there was such a thing as truth, they were very vulnerable and open to propaganda based on lies. And they became, it seemed to me, a kind of hermetically sealed thought system, which made it impossible for me to have a rational discussion with them, and instead they resorted to abuse to shut down the argument. That's really where I've remained, standing up for evidence, for the truth as I see it, for reason, for justice, for morality, for the betterment of society, and unfortunately I've been called right-wing as a result.
Well, so when did you meet our Labour Party, Melanie? You described them perfectly. Now, what has fascinated me has been the kind of this weird marriage between the left and Islam. Now, you've lived in London. You wrote a brilliant book, Londonistan, about the rise of Islam through immigration, Muslim immigrants pouring into London, and it turned London into what you described as Londonistan, a book I'd tell everybody to go and read. Talk us a little bit through that thesis.
Well, what happened in Britain was that it became culturally, I think, very confused, and the West has followed, but I think Britain was a leader in this. Britain became secular faster than other European countries, and it therefore lost touch with the bedrock principles upon which Western civilization is based, which are basically biblical principles. And in turning against those principles, it lost sight of various basic ideals, such as truth and lies, and above all, it lost touch with and, in fact, denied that there was anything superior about Western civilization. And in that state of mind, it became vulnerable to the idea that you couldn't be in judgment over anyone who was in the developing world, any culture from the developing world, because they had the same status as the West. And as a result of that, it was unable to see the threat from radical Islam. It opened its doors to it, it was hospitable to it, and remains in that state of confusion even now.
Melanie, you're touching on this question of whether discrimination is a positive or a negative thing. And certainly in the ancient world, people would have described someone of discriminating tastes. Even in the modern world, somebody who could differentiate the valuable from the not valuable. We seem to be in a mad scramble to entirely evacuate any judgment about value on cultural questions.
I think that's right. I think we've got ourselves terribly confused. I personally passionately believe that one should stand up against bigotry and prejudice and true discrimination. But because we have become confused, we no longer understand that there is a difference between discriminating wrongly against people and standing up for values which, unless we stand up for them, will disappear. Unless we in the West say that the West is better than the rest, because in the West we uniquely believe in the equality of all individuals. We uniquely believe in equality for women. We uniquely believe in freedom of religion and in the freedom to have no religion and other basic principles that we uniquely believe in political freedom and in democracy and so on. Unless we stand up and say those are better than the rest and we must uphold them, then we are going to fall victim to precisely what we've done, which is to say that we're not standing up for that, and therefore we become confused, and therefore we allow people who stand for the opposite to have kind of equal parity with us. And that has muddled the situation completely, so that as a result, in Britain, and I should say, although you mentioned that I have a place in Jerusalem, I spend my time between London and Jerusalem. In Britain, we have allowed a situation to arise in which we have seen the development of a parallel jurisdiction, a parallel set of laws, Islamic laws, governing Muslim communities. Now, in the West, it's an absolutely cardinal principle. It's one law for all. You cannot have a democratic, liberal Western society that does not understand that the same law applies to everybody. And consequently, in our desire to be nice to a minority, we have allowed ourselves in Britain to undermine the basic bedrock of a liberal democratic society, which is one law for all, by allowing the development of Sharia law and a separate or parallel, informal jurisdiction to develop.
So Melanie, you've been to Sydney, and we had a great day when you were out here in Sydney, and I hope you'll be coming back. But we're a long way away. Just tell us, really, how bad is it in Europe, the Islamification of Europe? We see things on YouTube, and has it changed the face of Europe?
Well, it's always different when you're living in a country to people who are looking from outside. It's more complicated. It is perfectly possible still to live in Britain and not feel any of these things. If you're somebody who's not concerned about these things, you just don't see them. And it's possible not to see them. And Britain is different from other European countries, which are different from each other. For example, in France, to be a Jew in France is to be in a state of some significant danger, because Islamic anti-Semitism in France is very much more violent than it is, say, in Britain. And so the situation is different everywhere that you look. But in general, Europe is in a very bad way, because Europe cannot bring itself to say that there is something fundamentally dangerous to itself about bringing in millions of people who not only subscribe to a different culture, which is the culture of Islam, but believe that Europe has to adapt to Islam rather than they having to adapt to Europe. And that is the big difference. There are millions of Muslims who do want to adapt to European ways, who are perfectly loyal, decent, untroublesome British citizens. But unfortunately, the proportion of those Muslims in Britain and in Europe who do not want to adapt to European or Western ways and want instead the Islamization of Britain and Europe is very great. And that is a problem that Europe is not facing up to. And while it doesn't even acknowledge that that's a problem, I'm afraid it's going to be defeated by it.
Can I say, Melanie, you talk about Europe, but it was very instructive to me in the recent US presidential election. We found that the strongest support anywhere in the country for Hillary Clinton came from Washington, D.C., which I think polled at 90% Hillary. The swamp was fully on board. But the second highest distinctive demographic mine of support for Hillary Clinton came from American Jewry, American Jews voted for Hillary Clinton at about 70-30. And in particular, in the swing seat like Florida, you know, why has the American Jew given up on the idea that there should be anything distinctive about Judaism or indeed about Western civilization?
Well, this is a very good question, and it touches on a very, very difficult situation. American Jews are different from Jews in other countries. They're certainly different from Jews in Britain, which have not followed this demographic curiosity. Jews in Britain are mainly conservative voters, going in tandem with the fact that they become more prosperous over the decades. American Jews, as the saying goes, earn like Episcopalians and vote like Puerto Ricans. They have remained very liberal. And that is mainly because American Jews, for reasons which probably are too complicated for us to go into now, have wrongly assumed that Jewish values are identical to liberal universalist values. Jewish values are not universalist. They are very particular. In my view, they have universal application because they basically stand for good things like the equality of all people, putting other people first, and so on, social justice, the rule of law, and so on and so on. But they are particular values. They're not universal. And American Jews have told themselves that there is no distinction between Jewish values and left-wing values, which truly are universal, which which set out fundamentally to negate anything distinctive or particular about a culture in the interest of producing a kind of brotherhood of man utopia, which in fact leads, in my view, to totalitarianism, repression, and the evacuation of morality. But that's the hook that American Jews have basically got themselves onto. And what we're seeing is that American Jewry in itself is turning away increasingly from the precepts of Judaism. And I include in that those American Jews who sign up to progressive Jewish denominations, as a result of which their children are losing contact completely with Judaism. They are turning against the state of Israel, and they are signing up in ever-increasing numbers to left-wing ideologies which are fundamentally hostile to and destructive of Western principles.
Well, hopefully, Melanie, we're avoiding that in this country. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu had a very successful visit out to Australia several months ago, warmly welcomed by the Jewish community here, which was great to see. But I hope we don't see that kind of American-style attitude creeping into Australia. Now, the mantra that we always hear from every politician on all sides of politics is as soon as you mention Israel, Palestine, oh, we all believe in the two-state solution. They don't even know what they're talking about, but they say it. It's the mantra, and it gets you off the hook. Talk us through. You have very different ideas, far more interesting, imaginative and realistic ideas about the future of Israel and a so-called Palestinian state. Talk us through that.
Yes, I think that people who talk about the two-state solution, just like people on the other side of the argument who say that the solution is for Israel to annex and incorporate Judea and Samaria, I think both of those views are fundamentally misunderstanding the situation and are fundamentally wrong. I think they're starting from the wrong premise. They're looking at it through the wrong end of the telescope. They are both, in their very opposing and different ways, addressing the question of how should the land look? How should the region look? How should this land be divided up between these two warring sides, the Jews and the Arabs, the Israelis and the Palestinians? I think that that's not the question at all. This is not a conflict about the division of the land. This is not a conflict about how equitably the land should be divided up. This is a conflict going back 100 years, which is all about the attempt by the Arab and Muslim world to completely destroy the Jewish homeland. It basically rests on the premise that the Jews have no right to be in this land at all as a self-governing autonomous entity. Now, as a result, we've seen 100 years of a an exterminatory, and I would say even genocidal attempt to destroy the Jewish homeland completely. And that remains the aim of the Arab and Muslim world, despite what they may say occasionally in English. They actually constantly say they wish to destroy Israel. Now, when you have an unconscionable and non-negotiable agenda like that, an agenda of exterminatory aggression, the response of the so-called civilized world has always been, in every other conflict, to basically try and stop that agenda and to end that war of exterminatory aggression and to treat the aggressor as a social and political and diplomatic pariah. That is the only way you can defeat this kind of agenda. You have to basically stop the war to destroy another people. But instead, for virtually the whole of the last century and continuing to this day, the so-called civilized world has incentivized and effectively condoned this war of aggression by calling it something different, and has effectively punished by hanging out to dry its victims, which the West notionally supports. In other words, by saying that the Palestinians have a right to a state, they are basically saying that the Arabs should be rewarded for trying to exterminate the state of Israel. I think the aim should be instead to say this war of extermination has to stop. That is the beginning and the end of the argument. Until you, the Arab side, stop this war of extermination, you will get nothing from us, the so-called civilized world. You will get no funding. You will get no diplomatic recognition. When you stop this war, then we can all talk about how the situation on the ground should be resolved. It's as absurd to say, in my view, that we should be looking at a state of Palestine or annexing Judea and Samaria as it would have been in 1939 to say, you know what, the real concern is, where are the Sudeten Germans going to live? Are they going to be part of Czechoslovakia? Are they going to be part of Germany? No. The aim in 1939 was to stop Hitler, to stop the war of aggression. That's the way we should be reframing the Middle East conflict if we really do want a solution based on justice to this terrible situation.
I agree with you. The way the Palestinians reward terror, so giving pensions to people who kill Jews, we saw 3 Jews killed yesterday. We see constantly the rewarding, as you're saying, not only by the Palestinians of the murderers, building statues, treating murderers like pop stars. A famous case was the Australian girl, the daughter of Arnold Roth, who was murdered, and then the murderess was celebrated as a hero. You're right to say that, but what is so insidious is that so many on the left in countries like Australia, in the West, also reward the Palestinians at the UN, wiping out history. We've seen attempts to wipe out history where ancient Jewish tombs, like Jericho's tomb, are suddenly redefined as Palestinian. Tell us your thoughts on this wiping out of Jewish history.
Yes, well, I mean, first of all, it's the Western European nations which are funding the Palestinians to wipe out Jewish history, and they're funding them to promote hatred and a desire to murder Jews and to destroy Israel in their educational materials. That's what they are teaching their children, and the West is paying for it. As far as the left is concerned, the hypocrisy is quite staggering. I mean, one has to say as a caveat that many people on the left really don't know that what they're saying is poisonous lies, because unfortunately no one has ever told them that there is another story, let alone that that other story is actually the historical and moral truth of the situation. But what the left has actually signed itself up to is the very negation of what it purports to stand for. The left, above all, is anti-racist, isn't it? It's anti-colonialist. And the situation, the facts of the case are these, that it is only the Jewish people for whom Israel was ever their national kingdom. The Jewish people are the only extant indigenous people of the land of Israel. And the suggestion or the belief that the left has, and so many in the West have, that that Israel was originally occupied by Palestinian Muslims going back since time immemorial is in fact a complete fabrication and a reversal of the truth. And therefore, what the left have signed up to is support for colonialism, for oppression, for lies, and for ethnic cleansing. They are supporting, for example, a state of Palestine in which the so-called Palestinians have said repeatedly there will be no Jew allowed to live there, no Israeli. Now, Israel is 20% or so of Israel are Israeli Arabs. Why can't there be a state of Palestine, hypothetically in the future, which has Jews living in it? Why can't it simply be a state whose boundaries, borders, would be drawn around the Israelis who live there in that territory at the moment? No reason at all. But the Arabs won't have that. They wish to ethnically cleanse Jews from a future state of Palestine. And that is the agenda to which the left has signed up.
Fantastic. Melanie, we could talk all evening. Your passion is fantastic. If you were here, we'd have you on Outsiders like a shot. Fantastic talking to you. If anyone wants to read more of Melanie, melaniephillips.com, fantastic book, Guardian Angel, and Londonistan, and plenty of other material there. Thank you so much, Melanie. Lovely to see you again, and thanks for talking to us today. See ya.
Thanks very much.